Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our newest and our final segment of Apex in Conversation for the 2020 year. We're joined by the great Stuart J. Ishimaru and the Honorable Jenny R. Yang. For today's guest, Stuart served as the inaugural director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from 2012 to his retirement in 2018. And he also served concurrently as the director of the Office of Equal Opportunity and Fairness. He previously was appointed by President Bush to serve as commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 2003 to 2012, and was designated by President Obama to serve as acting chairman from 2009 to 2010. Jenny Yang is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, where she leads a workplace equity initiative to revitalize our anti-discrimination laws and dismantle systemic barriers to opportunity. Ms. Yang also served as the chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 2013 to 2018. Ms. Yang is also a strategic partner with Working Ideal, where she assists employers in the design and implementation of employment practices to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I'm passing it on to Stuart.
Anthony, thanks very much. Jenny, it's good to see you.
You too.
Hey, you've had a career that many aspire to, one of public service, and as I like to say, good guy work. Our paths have crossed at various times over the years. Can you tell us your path?
Sure, Stuart. It's really terrific to be here with you, and I want to thank Anthony and Apex for having us close out this really terrific series of interviews, and I'm honored to be a part of it and here with you today. I am thinking back to over 20 years ago, Stuart, when I first met you as a career trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Employment Litigation Section. I had come from the National Employment Law Project, where I was working with garment workers on unpaid overtime, and many of the workers were Asian Americans as well as Latinas, who had faced a variety of workplace abuses. And when I came to the Department of Justice, I was surprised to see that we did not have many cases in our section looking at issues impacting the Asian American and Latinx community. So I reached out to some other attorneys and we brainstormed on what could we do to change this? And we settled upon going to Stuart, who was at the time in our front office, which is as sort of a political position, which reviews the work of different sections. So we thought that Stuart would understand the need for us to really reach and serve all communities. So we marshaled some data and we went to Stuart and explained, the challenge that we saw, and he was very supportive. And through that effort, we were able to create a national origin working group that went out to communities. We translated materials into 13 different languages, and we were able to reach new communities that hadn't understood, the work of the Department of Justice on civil rights. So we created this sort of division-wide working group that then, when 9/11 happened, it became a vehicle, for addressing some of the backlash discrimination that the Muslim community, the South Asian, the Sikh community was experiencing. And so I think that was a really important experience for me to see how many of our government structures, are not necessarily designed to serve all communities. And particularly as communities grow through immigration, we need to understand where those communities are and how we serve them. So that was a really powerful experience. And sort of flash forward about 5 years later, I was flying on a plane to a mediation, and across the aisle from me was Stuart. And I said to Stuart, I really need to figure out what to do next. Stuart had already left because there was a transition from President Clinton to Bush. And Stuart said, well, my wife works at a law firm, Cohen Milstein, and they're looking to hire a civil rights associate. So once I got home, I applied for that position, and it was really a terrific experience to understand the role of the private bar in enforcing civil rights. When I was doing my job search then, leaving the Department of Justice, I was really only looking at nonprofit organizations. I hadn't realized how important the private bar was. And what I saw through 10 years of practice there is that the private bar is really doing a huge amount of the enforcement work because there aren't sufficient resources, either in government or in the nonprofit sector. So it's a really important part of defending workers' rights. So I worked with Stuart's wife, Aneshka, and who became a very good friend, and got to work with really excellent lawyers there. And, it had been a decade, and I was starting to think about what I should do next. And then Stuart again reached out and said, hey, Jenny, would you be interested in being considered by the White House for the EEOC commissioner position? Stuart was working on transitioning then to the CFPB and was looking out for, people that could represent. And I immediately said I was interested, but it was also daunting because there was the whole process of actually getting nominated and then getting confirmed. And I would have never put myself out for that position on my own if Stuart hadn't reached out and asked me about it. So what I really took away was how important it is to have mentors and people who are willing to kind of encourage you to think about, right, all kinds of opportunities that you might not be considering. So when I tell people that story, Stuart, they say, I need to get to know Stuart better.
Hardly. No. So how much of this was planned out? Did you have sort of a master plan when you were starting off, or at any point did you know various things would come up?
So I absolutely did not have a master plan, but I was inspired to focus on issues of civil rights and employment discrimination by my mother, Sue Pai Young, who many people know, because she has been very active in the Asian American community. And I remember as a young child, she shared that she experienced discrimination at work. She felt excluded, her work wasn't recognized. And I saw how deeply that experience impacted her, her dignity, her self-worth. And I also remember telling her when I was in elementary school that I had written an essay about discrimination. And I thought she was going to be proud of me because she had talked to me about this, but instead she looked horrified. And she said, "You didn't use the word racism, did you?" And I was like, "No, I think it just said bias and discrimination." And so she looked a little bit relieved. But we were one of the few Asian American or non-white families of any sort in our suburban New Jersey town. And she was worried that somehow our teacher would think badly of me if I was talking about these concepts. So what I learned at an early age is that discrimination was incredibly harmful and powerful, but you weren't supposed to talk about it because it made other people uncomfortable. So that, I think, really stuck with me throughout sort of my career, right? About how hard it is to talk about these issues, but how important it is that we do in order to address them. So as I was in college, I did a Cornell and Washington program. And I interned for Senator Bill Bradley, who was my senator from New Jersey at the time. And I did because my mother said, look, if you want to change the system, you first need to understand how the system works from the inside. So I thought that was good advice. And I wanted to understand really how to make change happen. And it was a very informative time to be in the Senate. I was writing a thesis as well on the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which I then went on to enforce throughout my career. But that process was sort of the starting place of sort of a curiosity of really understanding how does policy get made and who makes those decisions. So after I graduated from college, I decided to work on Bill Clinton's campaign. So I came to DC and eventually I worked on the transition as well as White House personnel. And I remember like walking down the hall of transition and another Asian American woman was coming my way and she just stopped and said, "Oh my God, another Asian American," because it was so rare at that time. Back in 1992, there were not many Asian Americans in the political sphere. And we were also working to staff the new administration, right? And I saw how important it was to have a broad and diverse base of people to consider to really ensure that the government was serving everyone. So I think that, was really informative for me.
Things have changed so much. I remember the 92 transition. I first started doing politics back in 84 on the Mondale
Right.
campaign. And there were literally, you could count the Asians nationwide who were working on the campaign on two hands.
Right.
Not very many people. Certainly by 92 it got better.
Right.
But I get the look of surprise on people's faces when they saw you in the hall, because frankly there weren't many. And
right. Yeah. And you were one of the first, like probably also on the Hill, right?
Yeah.
Asian Americans.
There were very, very few of us on Capitol Hill then, and and that's changed a lot, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Over the last 20, 25 years, the number of folks who have come to Washington, who have worked in public service or in public policy or in politics has really changed. And there are a lot of folks around at various levels. It's still not easy, but it's a huge difference than it was back then. Can you talk a little bit about barriers you may have faced specifically as an AAPI woman?
Sure. Well, yeah, throughout my career, I've often been one of the few women, doing an argument in a court or in a team of lawyers, as well as, in leadership positions. And I think sometimes people, particularly in the law, they think you have to have a certain style to be successful, and it needs to be aggressive and loud to be a leader, right? And that's not who I am, and that's not who I've led. I mean, that's not how I've led. So what I learned, particularly in my role at the EEOC, is that I just need to own who I am and not try to take on a different personality that might seem what a leader should look like, but really to lead, authentically from who I am, and to not really worry about people who might make assumptions about either your ability or whether you're going to fight hard for something that you believe in because you're an Asian American woman. I remember back in college, I had a professor, and I was never one to raise my hand very often in class. And she said to me after she read my exam, she said, "Jen, as an Asian American woman, people are going to think that you don't have anything to say unless you actually make the effort to say it." And so that was the first time anyone had said anything like that to me. And it was really an awakening of sorts. And throughout my career, even though I wasn't naturally inclined, right, to be the one to speak up in a big meeting, I made myself do it because I thought it was really important for people to know I was willing to share, to take the risk of sharing an idea, to carry it forward and being a part of that discussion.
I've always wondered, since I've actually never practiced law, what's the impact of actually having practiced law and public service? How has that impacted your view of how to best serve?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really helpful perspective because I've really approached my career by trying to understand, how do you make change happen and how do you make progress stick, right? Litigation, which is what I spent my career doing before the EEOC, is a powerful vehicle to get the attention, right, of an institution, an actor, to listen to concerns that may have been raised but not addressed and not taken seriously. So it's a way to force change, to prove the facts, to prove your case, to show you're right, to help shape our understanding of the law and what it means to advance equality. And so that very kind of detailed work, right? It is like the detailed work of proving the facts to establish the case to advance the law is such a critical part of how our law advances. Like we've seen that, for example, on issues of LGBTQ discrimination, right? That was a big issue facing us at the EEOC, and really understanding what is the best meaning of Title VII. And, we took the position that Title VII covered discrimination against the LGBT community because we thought that was the best reading of the law. And we both, did that in our federal sector decisions, but also in litigation, because it was really through litigation that you could make that position stick, right? You have a certain amount that you can do through policy, right? The EEOC can, as you know very well, Stuart, can issue guidance, can issue regulations under some statutes, and can help clarify the interpretation of the law. But in order to make that stick, you ultimately have to be able to prove that in court.
Right.
And so it is important to understand that.
Yeah. Any difference between private practice and government practice, especially being a litigator?
Yeah, there is a lot of difference. I have to say, when there were terrific attorneys at the Department of Justice. But when I got to the firm, it was like, a bit overwhelming. The kind of the caseload, the work, it was primarily litigation too. So everything was moving, right, in terms of the practice, and have to think about issues around class certification, whereas the government doesn't need to certify a class. So there are a lot more hurdles in many respects for private plaintiffs to prove a systemic case, whereas the government can bring it under pattern of practice authority. There are increasingly mandatory arbitration agreements that preclude workers from bringing their cases to court and require them to give up their rights to proceed as a class. So the government, has a really important role to play in those cases in particular, where workers cannot come together to prove, a common practice that may be discriminatory because of mandatory arbitration agreements. So I think it's really important for the two to complement each other and to ensure that there's a way for private plaintiffs to actually enforce the law. It is, it's a challenging practice to develop and ensure that you can support the work, but it's so critical.
Right. Well, we're in the middle of a transition now, and I know people all over the country are interested in what that'll look like, and some people are thinking about switching over to be part of the new administration. You've seen this stuff at the highest levels, and was wondering if you had thoughts on why it's important for AAPIs to be part of public service.
Yeah, that is a great question. I hope a lot of people will be thinking about opportunities to serve, because the only way that our government can truly serve the entire country is to ensure that the public servants working in the government are representative of all our communities. And, I definitely saw that firsthand, because, people bring the experience, right, of their life, of their community, to understanding where government services, government enforcement are needed, where, for example, you may need language access that doesn't exist. So I think it's really important in all parts of government, right, that we have qualified, diverse public servants. And I think it's particularly important for Asian Americans now, because we are seeing a rise in hatred and discrimination against the community because of fears that have been stoked because of COVID. And there are many people who have been afraid to leave their house. People, over 30% of adult Asian Americans reported experiencing like racial slurs and jokes. A quarter of young people reported experiencing racism since the outbreak of the pandemic. And we need to ensure that Asian Americans are not othered, right? That has been the challenge that Asian Americans have faced throughout our history, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese internment to 9/11, right? It is really scary to see how quickly that othering can be activated against the community. And it's so important that we have people within the government to understand how those kinds of harmful biases can impact the community. Often people don't think Asian Americans experience discrimination. They just don't realize, because of the model minority myth, because data is looked at in the aggregate, that there are many Asian Americans. It's an incredibly diverse community, both countries of origin as well as income levels. And there are a lot of needs for the community in terms of government service. And so I'm really happy to see that Apex and NCAPA have come together to create a resume bank for people who want to serve in a new administration. I think that's really important, to pull together the most diverse and qualified group of applicants that we can. And also, I know the transitions typically have more information on their website. I'm sure that will be forthcoming on how people who are interested in serve can, start that process.
Yeah, no, that's right. The resume bank is very important, but there's also other ways to serve. You can apply for regular jobs, career jobs with the new administration, and there are terrific opportunities. It opens up jobs around town and in think tanks and advocacy organizations, which, it really sort of mixes the pot. And if people are interested in doing this kind of work writ large, it's a great opportunity and a great time to be a part of the mix. But it leads me to my other question, because you're now doing work at the Urban Institute. It's a very prestigious think tank, a lot of things going on. Can you tell us about your current work there, and what sort of role do think tanks have in shaping the debate, and why should AAPIs be part of that mix as well?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Stuart, because it is also important that within the think tank environment, we really have a diverse group of researchers and people thinking about what are the solutions to some of our most challenging problems. So at the Urban Institute, I'm building a new workplace equity initiative where we're looking at both the sort of future of work, how are changing workplace structures impacting people across different workplaces, in increasing independent contractor relationships or temporary work, how we see more precarious work structures that shift risk onto workers for things like, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, disability, right? And many independent contractors do not have protections from our anti-discrimination laws against sexual harassment, wage and hour, health and safety. So an increasing part of the workforce is being excluded from protection. So we're really looking at how do we strengthen protections. We're also looking at how we can ensure that as technology evolves, right, there's an increasing reliance on algorithms and technological systems to shape hiring, both who's recruited, how resumes are screened, how people are ranked and sorted through games, through video-based assessments, as well as performance evaluations and, throughout the employment process. So this was an issue I had been very interested at the EEOC. We had a commission meeting on it and started to build a task force. This was, and this is an increasingly important issue, that we understand how we should set our standards so that you can audit some of these systems in advance. Otherwise, it's really a black box and workers don't know how the systems work. And there's very little chance that bias in the system will be detected. And many of these systems, people may have seen some of the news articles about like Amazon trying to build a resume screening system. And despite, obviously having a lot of expertise, it built gender bias into the system, because the system was trained on resumes that were primarily male and primarily men were hired. And so the system, because that was the data set, it learned to actually take points off people's resume if they were women. If it said like women's chess club or it was a all women's school, it actually said just because of that you were less qualified. And they weren't able to address that, so they did take that off the market. But it's important, right, that you are looking really into how these algorithms are operating. So that's another area that we're working on, and the broader bucket of using evidence-based research to ensure that we are actually addressing equal opportunity in our workplace design. So one of the things that often people said to me at the EEOC is like, who is our think tank? Like, who's helping us think about the issues on the horizon, or how we should be really thinking about focusing our resources? And so what I've been interested in at Urban is really thinking about some of those issues, right? How can government enforcement really play a role in incentivizing employers to make it a higher priority, right? To do the self-auditing, to look at how they're hiring, right? Many of our existing systems that are very well established, like a subjective interview and resume review, are well documented to perpetuate discrimination. But there isn't a lot of incentive to change it, right? Unless there is really a good reason to focus on it. And that's, I think, the work that I'm really interested in doing. How do we help employers, many who really want to do the right thing, who are committed to racial equity, but often don't know what those things are? Like, let's look at the evidence. Let's help employers get it right, and help workers really understand how to assert their rights throughout this process. So, another issue I've been looking at is, how the power imbalance between employers and workers really undermines the enforcement of civil rights, and the way many of our structures and doctrines, like our complaint system, right, which requires a person who's very vulnerable in a workplace to publicly charge the employer with discrimination. Very few people will do that. And we saw that with the Me Too movement. There were studies after showing 99.8% of people who experience harassment will never file a complaint about it, because the ramifications are so huge. You could lose your job, and not just with this one employer, but as your reputation in the field, right? So that's our system, right? As you know well, Stuart, that's the primary system that we're relying on to understand where discrimination exists. And that system is going to miss the bulk of systemic problems. So I think it's really important that the government and others focus on much more proactive types of enforcement and understanding where problems exist, and not putting the primary burden on vulnerable workers.
Let me ask you one final question. What does it mean to be a resilient leader?
Well, I have this card on my desk that I will share. It's from Jackie Berrien, the late Jackie Berrien, who served as the chair of the EEOC when I first joined, and I had the honor of serving with her and following in her footsteps. But on my first day as chair of the agency, she gave me this card, and I will read to you what it says on the front. It's from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it says, "Finish each day and be done with it. You have done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities have crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. You shall begin it serenely, and with too high a spirit to be encumbered with your old nonsense." And I've kept that with me on my desk because it reminds me that everyone is going to have mistakes, blunders creep into their day. And we can't expect that we will be perfect, everything will be perfect. And that's just part of leading, right? Is understanding. So I'll give myself a little bit of time to just process it, understand what you can learn from something that went awry, but to try not to stew in it, right? Because that's not very productive in terms of the use of time when you have a problem to solve. So rather than just letting yourself rerun everything in your mind over and over again, like, I'll do it for a little bit, and then you go, okay, you got to move forward and really think about, what do you learn from it? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And then how do we solve the problem? So for me, that is an important reminder about resiliency and leadership, and just knowing that you're going to face crises, you're going to face conflict, and that's part of leading.
Jackie was a great leader and a good friend, and she passed far too early. And
she did. I miss her guidance all the time. And, she was a really tremendous and thoughtful leader, and also a very resilient one. She could stay calm in the face of many crises.
And with that, Anthony, back to you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, Jenny Yang. It was a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate the inspiration that you give to our younger audience, knowing that, you know, especially with the transition of administration coming up, you know, a lot of folks are looking towards that new position, that new role that they want to serve. And AIPACs, as you know, we're all about getting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders involved in public service, whether it's from grassroots efforts and organization all the way to elected office. So I really wanted to thank you for, you know, being that inspiration, and making sure that, you know, when people are at these decision-making tables, that we are, you know, we are seen, and so that we can increase that representation. Without that representation, none of our, you know, issues are brought to light because no one's there to talk about it. So, you know, as you mentioned earlier, AIPACs has launched with NCAPA the resume bank for presidential appointee positions. I'll drop the link in the chat for everyone. Please check out that link, submit your resumes. This is more than the perfect time to get involved in public service. And I just, again, wanted to thank you for your kind words and your inspiration, especially when you mentioned how, you know, as an AAPI woman, no one is going to assume that you have anything to say unless you raise your hand. And, you know, that really sticks with me. Even though I'm not a woman, you know, many of my colleagues who are, you know, I think they'll take that to heart and really follow that advice, because it is a new generation, you know. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Anthony.
No problem.